Welcome back to Agelist. Today's episode is about titties and the passing of time. Boobies, breasts, milk jugs, or as Joan Rivers likes to describe my breasts, or did because she's dead. 2 tennis socks with sand in the toes. We're going to talk about what it means to reclaim your body and your less than buoyant boobs. We all have breast tissue. All human beings have breast tissue. And tits that are bigger, fuller, with larger nipples and are on women, their purpose, their meaning, their association has always been turned into less than purposeful. Does that make sense? Or less about what they're used for or made for, and more about the gaze of others. And that's including me, because low-key, I think I'm kind of obsessed with breasts. Maybe it's because I was never breastfed, or maybe it's because my mother says that I have my father's chest, but I've always thought about breasts. What makes them, and I'm doing air quotes, perfect, desirable, bountiful, perky, saggy, old, and diseased. And when I say diseased, I'm talking about dis-ease and ill. There is a lot of value placed on breasts, especially young breasts. My relationship to tits, especially my own, goes way, way back to, Mrs. Gluck. That was her name. I think that was 4th grade. I remember feeling like going to scratch my chest, and I felt this lump. And I believe it started on the left side. And what it was a breast bud. I remember freaking out. And of course, me always getting on my report card, just because inappropriate in general, saying inappropriate things. I went right up to Mrs. Gluck and I was like, oh my gosh, I probably have cancer. I did not have cancer. And I also do not remember anyone explaining to me about breast buds. In fact, it probably wasn't until I started to learn about reproductive health that I even knew what breast buds were. Later, as a medical professional and working with trans women, especially working with trans women who were just starting medication, I felt like, thank God I had that experience as a kid, because here I am helping to usher these women into their transition and explaining to them, those are breast buds that you're getting, those little lumps. So don't be afraid. Oh my God, I have 2 friends who had the most beautiful boobs, and I'm going to name them Stephanie and Mina. They both had children. I'm pretty sure that they both breastfed. I could be wrong. I haven't looked at their tits in years, but they were always really just amazing. I am so interested in breasts and the complicated relationship that we have with breasts, and my own complicated relationship with my own mammary glands, that I wrote my thesis for grad school on breastfeeding. I wrote it specifically on, and it was a study, and I think I only used maybe 100 and something of the responses, but I had over 300 responses. It was a bilingual study, because I'm fancy like that, on pleasure from erotic nipple stimulation pre-pregnancy as an indicator of positive initiation of breastfeeding. And then there was a second part, that after a substantial amount of weaning, like 6 months, did your relationship to erotic pleasure and nipple stimulation change? And if so, did it become more positive? Anyway, that was my study. I think it's a very interesting study. I wanted everyone to agree with me. So I was never one to like nipple stimulation in erotic play. I did not like it. I have friends, and I will not name them. I have friends who really dug it and would put nipple clamps on and like get really turned on, could orgasm from it, but not me. And so for me, breastfeeding was challenging because I already didn't associate having my tits sucked on as something fun. I thought it was fucking annoying, honestly. However, after breastfeeding, now I did extended breastfeeding, I kind of got tricked into it. I started the breastfeeding and it was really hard for me. But then as it got easier and easier and easier, I continued to breastfeed for 2 years. This is my point though, after breastfeeding for a long time, my association with pleasure and nipple stimulation was like 180. completely different. Did my research come out that way? No, it did not. There was really no change for most folks, and the majority of people who did respond already found nipple stimulation pleasurable. Anyway, all that to tell you that there's something about breasts. There's just something about them. There's something about them. Speaking of the friend that used the nipple clamps and could orgasm, and I'm going to get to aging in a second. When we talk about that problematic relationship with breasts and society, in 1992 or 1996, I'd have to look at the exact paper, a mother called up La Leche League. La Leche League is a non-profit volunteer organization that people come in community and they learn about breastfeeding. It's a grassroots organization, I guess you would call it. There's hotlines for it and you can get breastfeeding help. So she called up because she was orgasming every time she was breastfeeding, or a few times. Well, at that point in the 90s, the 1900s, 1990s, the La Leche League leader that she talked to called ACS, called Child Protective Services on the mother, and said that the mother was obviously molesting the child. That was not the case. Breastfeeding can bring on orgasm. And I have friends, especially when I was in the baby world and I was a doula, I knew people who were orgasming from breastfeeding. I was not one of them. And they also, even some doulas, found it super confusing because nobody was talking about it. Nobody was talking about these big erotic feelings that you could have. And when I say erotic, I am talking about love. But again, this is kind of the first transition of how the world looks at this body part for their own pleasure and consumption, and how when you put those body parts to work in a particular fashion, how it's harder to have support. So what is breast tissue made out of? And is there a difference between male breasts and female breasts? According to Johns Hopkins University, the male breast structure is nearly identical to the female breast, except the male breast tissue lacks the specialized lobules, since there is no physiologic need for milk production by males. Cleveland Clinic says male and female breast nipples have many nerves that enhance sexual arousal. So in the mammary glands, we have the lactiferous or milk ducts and those mammary lobules. Male breasts, however, everybody can possibly get breast cancer. Of course, going to talk a little bit more about the sexual aspects because this is ageless and that's what we do. We talk about sex. Are men required to have mammograms? No, they're not. But because they have less tissue, the idea is that finding an abnormality may be easier to find. But what does this mean? And I want to talk a little bit about squeezing the joy out of the boobs, meaning the mammogram. I had my first mammogram at 50. I didn't have it at 40. And you may be thinking, oh my God, why wait so long? That was a joint decision between my provider and me, and we were using the United States Prevention Services Task Force guidelines, which say essentially that if you have no risks, family risks, that you can wait for your first mammogram until 50. I was still doing my monthly self-breast exams. I know that there's some talk about stopping those, but I'm not going to tell you to stop doing them. I think either you need to do them or you get somebody to do them with you for fun. But I was doing that. I had already breastfed for, 2.5 years, 2 and 3 months. So that's 4 and 9 months. And then 3 more years after that, 7, 8.25 years. So more than 8 years, I'd already breastfed. There are some studies that talk about breastfeeding being beneficial for lower your risk for breast cancer and uterine cancer. Anyway, I was 50. And I was really scared because I've heard so many horror stories and people freaking out and it's so painful and it's so miserable and it's so this and it's so that. But I didn't find it to be, maybe because I have the 2 tennis socks with sand in the toes, I didn't find it to be so miserable, but I was super nervous. But I did it. And all was well for me. I had thought at one point, because I had a friend who was like, just do the ultrasound. So there are different ways to look at the breast. There's the mammogram, which is essentially an x-ray of your breast. You place your breast onto a plate. Another kind of see-through plastic comes down. It tries to compress breast tissue and some of your armpit, right? Some of like the skin that goes into the armpit area. Compress as much of that as possible so that they can see if there's any spots, anything lights up, as opposed to an ultrasound where, like any other ultrasound, it's sound bouncing off of material and showing fluid and what might be solid material. There's also thermography. So thermography uses an infrared camera to detect temperature changes and differences within your breast tissue. This is from MD Anderson Cancer Center. Like literally, I Googled it. During a thermogram screening, the machine never touches your body. On a thermogram image, hot spots appear red compared to the surrounding tissue that appears yellow, green, or blue. When you go to breastcancer.org, they say that the idea of thermography is because cancer cells are growing and multiplying very fast, blood flow and metabolism are higher in the cancer tumor. As blood flow and metabolism increase, skin temperature goes up. Thermography has been used for several decades, but there is no evidence to show that it's a good screening tool to detect breast cancer early, when cancer is most treatable. And then they use a quote saying that mammography, which is an X-ray picture of your breast, is the most effective breast cancer screening method and only method proven to increase the chance of survival through early detection. So those are kind of the three ways to check. We go through these phases where first we get those breast buds. Like I go back to 16 Candles where the grandma like goes to squeeze her boobs. If you saw 16 Candles, which I'm guessing you know what I'm talking about, because if you're listening to this, you know what 16 Candles the movie is if you haven't seen it. And if you're from Chicago, you definitely saw it. The squeezing at 16 Candles. So like the kind of growing up, prepubescence, training bras, they still do make quote unquote training bras. If you want to know a little bit more about my mammogram, I'll try and put it on agelust.co. But I did do a little really poo-poo on my mammogram. And you can actually see my breasts, the mammogram pictures, not my actual, although you can probably see my breasts someplace on the internet. I don't know. But you can see my mammogram pictures. Yeah, it was great. And maybe next time I will go ahead and video, like do a hey guys, like live, because I'm about to have it this month. Live from the mammography place. My tits. So that's about checking your breasts. I'm going to talk a little bit more about science-y stuff as it relates to pleasure, but what if you are a little bit breast obsessed and you like having full breasts and like you miss that? You know what I miss? The thing I miss about being in my 20s, and I hated my 20s, by the way, I miss that even though my boobs were tiny. Oh, and I was a bodybuilder for a long time. So like when I stopped lifting and my pecs weren't so big, like there was also some saggage happening. But anyway, I'm sure that if I went back in time, I would see that they were a lot perkier than they are absolutely now. And that's the thing that I remember seeing in Elle. They had like this laser bra that you could get. It was like this surgery and they did some laser and it lifted everything. So I decided to look up some non-surgical breast lifts. As I told you, I had a friend growing up whose dad was a plastic surgeon and, you know, he was always sticking those implants in. And there's a lot of people now talking about implants making them sick. I know that Pam Anderson, speaking about tits, breastfeeding, aging, I know that Pam Anderson, I think she's a big natural birther, and I think she reduced her breast size, her implants to breastfeed. I also know that the Kardashians breastfed as well. They didn't call me and ask me to be their lactation consultant. I just, like, that's some of the stuff that I came across. So I did some research on some minimally invasive or non-surgical breast lifts. And the first one I came across was called the vampire breast lift, VBL. And that's where they take platelet-rich plasma, so they draw your blood, and then they spin the blood so that it separates it. And they take this kind of clear, it's actually cloudy and yellow part, and that's the platelet-rich plasma. And they inject it into your chest, and it gives the appearance of a lift, which I kind of like. There's also Botox to target some of the sagging. Some people get filler. There is something called Tatas threading. So have you seen like those threads that people put in their face to like do these mini facelifty things? They're these strings with these barbs on it, like things to cut and lift. There is laser to increase your collagen. There is thermography, and there's also fat transfer. So you would get liposuction. That's more invasive, right? Get liposuction and take some fat from your waist, I guess, and then inject that into the breast. Of course, there are those exercises. We must increase our bust, to increase your pecs. And finally, there's always the good old push-up bra. So I wanted to give you those little tidbits. But say you don't really care about the breasts, you really care about the nipples, because the nipples are where you're feeling that erotic connection. Remember, I had said that all people, all genders, have nerve endings, and those nerve endings can lead to sexual arousal. And now you also know that some people will orgasm from breastfeeding. It's not that they're turned on by their kid. That's not what's fucking happening. It's how the body works. Now, why does it work that way? Because the brain and nerves. So I love to talk about the brain. And let's get into that. So one of the things that we check when we check for hormones, especially if we are giving testosterone to a male-bodied person, so somebody who is not making the testosterone that they had hoped that they were making, we want to see that the brain is working properly and all of the signals are moving. And I've talked about the hypothalamus and I've talked about the pituitary gland. And prolactin is a hormone that is made in the pituitary gland. So prolactin causes breasts to grow, and it also causes breasts to make milk during pregnancy and after birth. And prolactin levels are highest when you are pregnant, or if you have a pituitary tumor, you may have a higher prolactin level as well. There are other reasons too, but don't freak out. Please don't freak out. And of course, the pituitary gets messages from the hypothalamus. If you remember a little bit back, or if you've been listening, you know that I talk a lot about the hypothalamus and I talk about the pituitary, and there's an anterior and a posterior pituitary. And the follicle stimulating hormone, the anterior lobe of the pituitary has that prolactin, right? It sends that message around prolactin. It sends the message for thyroid stimulating hormone. It sends the message for luteinizing hormone, growth hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and also something called ACTH, which has to do with stress hormones and cortisol. The posterior lobe of the pituitary is where the oxytocin is. And remember, oxytocin is sometimes called that love hormone, the bonding hormone, right? So I want to read to you from The Science of Orgasm, which Dr. Whipple was one of the authors of. And I only mention Dr. Whipple because Dr. Whipple is a nurse, Beverly Whipple. Okay, so remember how I told you that some people can orgasm from nipple stimulation, some people can orgasm with breastfeeding. All right. I'm going to read directly page 8 and page 9. Not the whole thing, but yeah. Orgasm-inducing effects of breast or nipple stimulation may be due to sensory activity from the breast to certain of the same group of neurons in the brain that receives sensory activity from the genitals, specifically the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. We've talked about the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is part of the brain, right? These neurons produce and secrete oxytocin. The oxytocin released by suckling stimulates the contraction of the myoepithelial cells, muscular cells, and envelops the milk-secreting glands in the breasts. When these cells contract under the influence of oxytocin, they forcibly expel milk in the milk ejection or letdown reflex. The oxytocin can concurrently stimulate the uterine smooth muscle to contract. I'm skipping a little bit more. The oxytocin released during childbirth can also produce expulsion of milk from the breasts in women who are lactating. As described below, activation of the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus has been observed during orgasm. So it is likely that the activity of these neurons, the neurons to which they project, and the neurons that project to them, is involved in the pleasurable sensations of orgasm. And the description by some women of nursing and childbirth as generating orgasmic feelings. So it's all connected. But maybe you're not feeling that. Maybe you've never felt that. That could be your later in life project. As we age, right? We've already talked about aging and losing tissue in the breasts, losing volume in the breasts, and that there's not as much connective tissue. That doesn't mean that we lose sensation in the nipples. So there's actually something that is called a purposeful breast orgasm. I'm going to read a quote by somebody named Bird, B-I-I-R-D. The sensation is often described to travel across the whole body, build up like a rumbling brook until the floodgates open and you experience a powerful orgasm. How the fuck do you get that? That might be your next question. How do you get those floodgates to open from the breasts? Well, that's how we're going to end this episode. Well, let's talk about that. How do you open those gates? And what does that mean for aging? That is good fucking news. The more we learn about orgasming in different ways without using our genitals, the better it is for us, the better it is for our partners. Not because of what is possibly lacking, if you're lacking in lubrication, if you have painful sex, if you have a partner that has a lower libido, or a partner that doesn't have the erectile function that they used to have. And that can be, remember, everyone gets a hard-on. Everyone has erectile tissue. The more we look at orgasming from different ways, like the nipples, the more we can take the pressure off. So your body's changed. It changes as we age. And when it comes to orgasm and the possibility of having nipple orgasms or breast orgasms, this is really good news. We're taking the pressure off of the erectile tissue. We're taking pressure off of what we think sex should be. And we're allowing ourselves to explore pleasure instead, which is something that I look forward to. Not that I'm not exploring pleasure now, but I'm what they call in yoga a householder, right? So I still have kids at home, I'm working. And when I think of my later years, my wiser years, that gives us permission to explore pleasure, to have time to explore pleasure. Anyway, so I came across this website called Bird. I don't even know. I guess they sell something. Vibrators, suction, vibration suction, a NAMI. But they have an article or a blog post written by Ellie Cooper about breast orgasms and how to get them. And what she says is, if you explore your breasts and nipples patiently, you'll discover your body can deliver a lot more pleasure than you originally thought. In this article, she gives a description of breast orgasms, and she says most women say breast orgasms escalate gradually and then explode suddenly. The sensation is often described to travel across the whole body, building up like a rumbling brook until the floodgates open and you experience a... I don't think she really says it like that, but I like to say it that way. Some women also say breast and nipple orgasms feel especially potent and powerful during hormonal changes in your body during menstruation or pregnancy can increase your... Okay, so I'm going to stop right there because a lot of us are not really experiencing the joy of menstruation anymore. And in perimenopause, it can be pretty super fucking intense. But if you're not experiencing orgasms with menstruation, actually have been shown to be stronger. So if you are still bleeding, like go and get yours. But if you're not, that doesn't mean that you're not also experiencing nipple sensitivity, and you may be in your perimenopausal journey. And this whole idea of having somebody stimulate your nipples may feel like you're going to strangle somebody. However, you can also focus on the tissue around the nipples, so the areola. All that to say, having an orgasm that travels across your whole body and opens the floodgates, well, that sounds like a plan, a whole project. So how do you get this breast orgasm? It starts first, of course, I'm always going to say that it starts with the mind. So in this article, if you find it, and I'll link to it, it'll start with a breast massage. But the first thing that I want you to do is not go straight into that breast massage. I want you to set the mood. I want you to think about way before you even start to play with the breasts and play with this new sensation. If that's never been your thing, start to think about, how do you feel about your breasts? How do they look? How do they feel? Did you receive pleasure, erotic pleasure from stimulation? Or have they been a burden to you? So just wrap your mind around that. Wrap your mind around associating orgasm with the full body and not just the clitoris or the vagina or the vulva or the partner. And once you start to explore and think of the possibilities of orgasming from breast stimulation, then you can start to think about massage. And the massage that they suggest is that you do your own massage and you start very, very gently. You might want to use oils and stroke the breasts or run your fingers gently across your breasts. She suggests using knuckles, pinching the nipples, scratching, different sensations. Maybe you even start with wearing a shirt without a bra. And maybe the shirt is a texture like denim or silk, but a purposeful texture. I read another article that suggested you use ice in your nipple play. Well, of course, the ice is going to give you an immediate reaction. It's also going to make blood rush to the nipples because they're going to become erect. You have erectile tissue in the nose, in the nipples, and of course the clitoris and the penis. Step 2, according to this article, this blog post, is to invite your partner if you have a partner. And here's where you might want to also introduce toys. So remember I told you I had a friend who used nipple clamps and loves the nipple clamps. You don't have to get that drastic, but you can, if you've got an air pulse toy like the Rose or some of those other air pulse. The Rose is like the most famous one. You can play with that sensation on the nipples and around the breast. You can play with rope if that's something that you're starting to explore. You can play again with ice, whatever makes sense for you. And because you both, most likely, whoever you're with, in many cases probably has breast tissue as well and has nipples, this can be reciprocal. You can also start to incorporate genital play with the nipple massage. So what do I mean by that? It's purposely playing with your breasts while you are touching your clitoris, if you have a clitoris, or playing with your nipples while you're touching whatever your genitals are, or if your partner's touching your genitals. What does that sensation feel like? This is also a good time to think about once you're close to having an orgasm, you might focus more on the breast and the nipples because you'll start to associate orgasm with breast play and nipple play. So, a couple things to do. Get the mindset straight. So take some time and think about, what is my relationship with these things on my chest? The second idea is starting to explore sensations. Third, starting to incorporate not just the use of your hand or your partner's hand, but toys, ice, different textures, different cold, heat. Did you ever see the movie Mahogany? Like in Mahogany, one of my favorite movies. I could probably, if it was on, I could probably recite it. Anyway, at one point, she starts to take off and she's at a party and then she drips wax all over her nipples. That's Diana Ross I'm talking about. Anyway, I digress. But I was thinking different sensations. There's a candle that you can get that's like a candle and you light it and then it turns into massage oil. It used to be my kind of go-to hostess with the mostest gift to give to people. Anyway, sorry, unfocused. So you involve your partner, you're involving sensation, then you start to incorporate your genitals and toys. We talked about toys. So those are some steps, and you can start to put that into your repertoire or your bucket list or your to-do list, whatever makes sense for you, because we know that there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to let go of when we unleash the bra of what we think and how we view our breasts. And you get what I'm saying. I'm trying to be so fucking witty and it's just not working, but you get what I'm saying, right? There's a lot to unpack. How our image and our worth is so tied into our fertility. And that's not just for people with uteruses and mammary glands, and that's all of us. The worth and value of youth and beauty. And so how do we reclaim, especially when it comes to our breasts? How do we reclaim our bodies? Anyway, I hope that this was fun and interesting and now you got a project. And I hope you have a new appreciation for breasts and your own breasts and your partner's breasts and the breasts of those you love, because they're pretty interesting. They're pretty fanciful. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for listening. And it's so easy to support podcasts. And you can support this particular podcast, Ageless, by sharing, by liking, by putting it in your favorites. So you put the little bell in Spotify or you mark it in Apple Podcast, Google, all of it. If you have suggestions on what you'd like me to talk about, I would love to hear them. And share. You can also write a review. A review would be really super helpful as well. Anyway, you can always follow me on the Instagram at agelust.co. I am also on Facebook at agelust. And I love you to slide into my DMs. I love messages. I love talking to people. I love brainstorming. I love talking about shit. I like figuring things out. Anyway, thank you so much. And until next time, keep it lusty.